The Arizona sun hung high in the sky, casting sharp shadows across the tarmac of a quiet private aviation terminal just outside Scottsdale. It wasn't the kind of airport most people ever see. No long security lines, no crowded gates, no echoing announcements over tinny speakers. This place was calm, almost hushed, reserved for those who moved through the world with a different kind of rhythm. And on this particular afternoon, that rhythm belonged to Nia Okoro. She stepped out of a modest silver rental car, the kind you'd pick up at any major airport without a second thought. Her linen dress was simple, soft beige, slightly rumpled from hours in transit but clean. Her hair was pulled back in a low twist, and the only jewelry she wore was a thin gold chain her grandmother had given her years ago. In one hand she carried a well-worn leather tote that had traveled with her from Lagos, Nigeria, where she'd just wrapped up a week of intense negotiations. In the other, a travel mug of lukewarm tea she hadn't had time to finish. Nia wasn't flashy. She never had been. Even now, after building a company that powered entire villages with solar energy and employed over 200 people across 3 continents, she moved through the world with a kind of quiet focus. She didn't need to announce her success. It was in the way she listened, the way she solved problems, the way she remembered the names of every technician who worked on her team. And today, she was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the deep bone-level exhaustion that comes after holding everything together across time zones, languages, and expectations. All she wanted was to board her jet, stretch out in the quiet cabin, and close her eyes for the short flight back to California. She walked toward the sleek, white Gulfstream G650 parked near the far end of the tarmac. It gleamed under the desert sun, its windows tinted, its tail fin bearing the subtle logo of her company, a stylized sun rising over a grid of clean lines. She'd bought the jet 2 years ago, not as a trophy but as a tool. When you're flying between Nairobi, Accra, and Silicon Valley every month, commercial flights just don't cut it. Time was her most precious resource, and she'd invested in reclaiming it. As she neared the aircraft, a man in a crisp Navy uniform stepped forward. He looked to be in his early 30s, polished shoes, perfectly knotted tie, the kind of person who prided himself on reading a room in half a second. His name tag read Carter, and he wore a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, holding up a polite but firm hand. "This is a private charter. You'll want to head over to the main terminal for commercial departures." Nia paused. She blinked once, then offered a small, tired smile. "Actually," she said calmly, "this is my jet." Carter's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a barely perceptible tightening. He glanced past her as if expecting someone else to appear and correct the situation. "I understand," he said, voice smooth but edged with condescension. "But this aircraft is reserved for Ms. Okoro. She's expected later this evening." "I am Ms. Okoro," she replied, still calm. For a beat, silence hung between them. Then Carter let out a short, almost imperceptible laugh. "Sure you are," he said, turning slightly to signal to another crew member nearby. "Look, ma'am, I don't know what's going on, but you can't be here. Security will escort you back to the public area." Nia didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. But something inside her settled, like a stone dropping into still water. She'd been here before in different forms. In boardrooms where men assumed she was the assistant. At tech conferences where investors asked if her co-founder was the real engineer. In airports where security pulled her aside randomly 3 times in one trip. She knew the script, but this was her own plane, her own money, her own life's work sitting right in front of her, and she was being treated like a trespasser on it. She reached into her tote and pulled out her passport. Then her pilot's license, yes, she held one, though she rarely flew herself, and finally, the aircraft registration document with her name clearly printed as the owner. She handed them over without a word. Carter glanced at the papers, his confidence flickering. He flipped through them slowly, then looked up at her again, this time with a furrowed brow. "These could be borrowed," he muttered, though the words sounded weak even to him. At that moment, a ground handler passing by recognized her. "Ms. Okoro," he called out, jogging over. "Welcome back. Captain Vance has been waiting. He said you were coming in early." He nodded respectfully, completely unaware of the tension. Carter's face went pale. Before he could recover, the jet's door opened, and a tall man in a flight uniform stepped out. Captain Elias Vance, mid-50s, salt and pepper beard, calm eyes, had flown with Nia since she bought the plane. He took one look at the scene and immediately descended the stairs. "Nia," he said, genuine relief in his voice. "We weren't expecting you until tonight. Everything okay?" She gave him a small nod. Just a little confusion at the door. Elias turned to Carter, his expression shifting from warm to unreadable. "This is Ms. Okoro, the owner of this aircraft. And your employer." Carter stammered an apology, but Nia had already tuned him out. She thanked the ground handler, handed her documents back to Elias, and walked up the stairs into the cabin. The cool air inside felt like sanctuary. Plush seats, soft lighting, the faint scent of leather and coffee. Her space, her peace. But the moment stayed with her. As she settled into her favorite seat by the window, she replayed the exchange in her mind. It wasn't just about being disrespected. It was about the assumption behind it. The unspoken belief that someone like her couldn't possibly belong here. That wealth, power, and ownership had a certain look, a certain sound, a certain skin tone. And when reality didn't match that picture, the instinct wasn't to question the assumption. It was to dismiss the person. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her messages. Her assistant Lynn had sent a note. "Crew confirmed for your return flight."
"All set,"
Nia typed back. "Who hired this new ground team?" A minute later, Lynn replied. "They're from Skyward Management. They've handled your jet since last year. You approved the contract renewal in March." Nia remembered. She'd been in Ghana at the time, launching a new microgrid project. She'd skimmed the renewal email, trusted the process, signed off. She hadn't met any of them in person, and clearly they'd never bothered to learn who she was. She leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes. She wasn't angry, not yet. But she was awake, wide awake. Outside, Carter stood frozen near the wing, watching the jet's door close. He kept glancing toward the cabin, as if hoping she'd come back down and say it was all a misunderstanding. But she didn't, and a few minutes later a small crowd had gathered near the terminal fence. Other private flyers, ground staff, even a couple of pilots on break. Someone had filmed the whole thing on their phone. By the time the engines started to hum, the video was already making its way through group chats, then social media. Not because Nia posted it, she hadn't, but because someone thought it was wild or crazy or you won't believe this. The caption read, "Lady tries to board private jet, crew says no, then finds out it's hers." Within an hour, it had thousands of views. Nia didn't know any of that yet. She was sipping water, reviewing a proposal for a new battery storage system in Senegal, her mind already moving forward. But the incident had planted a seed, a quiet question. How many times has this happened, and how many times did no one see it? The jet taxied down the runway, lifting smoothly into the clear blue sky. Below, the tarmac shrank into a patchwork of concrete and steel. Up here, there were no assumptions, no judgments based on how someone dressed or what they looked like, just air, altitude, and the open horizon. But Nia knew the real work wasn't in the sky. It was on the ground, and she was just getting started. The jet ride back to California was quiet, too quiet. Nia usually used these hours to rest, to let her mind drift or catch up on sleep. But this time she couldn't settle. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Carter's face. The flicker of disbelief, the quick laugh, the way he'd looked past her like she was just noise in the background. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her, but it was the first time it happened on something that was undeniably hers. Her name was on the registration. Her money had bought every inch of that aircraft. And still she'd been treated like an intruder. By the time the wheels touched down in Van Nuys, she'd made a decision. She wasn't going to let this go. Not because she wanted revenge, she'd never been that kind of person, but because something deeper had been exposed. A crack in the system. And cracks, if left unattended, only get wider. She called Lynn the moment she stepped off the plane. "I need everything on the crew," she said. "Contracts, training records, internal communications, anything tied to Skyward Management and the people assigned to my jet." Lynn didn't ask why. She'd worked with Nia long enough to know that when her voice dropped half an octave and her sentences got short, it meant business. "I'll have it by morning," she replied. That night, instead of heading home, Nia went to her office in downtown Los Angeles. The building was mostly empty, just the hum of the HVAC and the soft glow of emergency lights in the hallway. She poured herself a glass of water, opened her laptop, and waited for Lynn's files to arrive. They came just after midnight. At first glance, everything looked normal. Standard aviation contracts, crew certifications, flight logs. But as Nia scrolled deeper, patterns began to emerge. Notes in internal team chats, casual, offhand, the kind people write when they think no one important is reading. One message from a flight coordinator named Derek read, "Still weird that Okoro flies solo so much. You'd think someone with that kind of jet would travel with an entourage." Another, from a different staffer. "Saw her photo again. Doesn't look like a CEO. More like a professor or something." Then there was an email thread from last fall. Skyward's operations manager had suggested reassigning aircraft N789SO to a higher utilization client during a quarterly review. The justification? Owner's usage is irregular, and asset could generate more revenue with a more consistent operator. Buried in the fine print was a note. Client profile doesn't align with typical G650 demographic. Nia read that line 3 times. Typical G650 demographic. She knew what that meant. Private jets like hers were usually owned by older white men, CEOs, hedge fund managers, celebrities. Not a black woman in her late 30s who built a clean energy company from scratch and preferred sandals over stilettos. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't outright racism, nothing you could pin to a single person or quote in a lawsuit. But it was there, woven into the language, the assumptions, the quiet decisions made behind closed doors. And that made it harder to fight. Because how do you prove bias when it's dressed up as business logic? The next morning, she met with Captain Elias at a small cafe near the airfield. He looked uneasy before she even sat down. "I heard what happened," he said quietly, stirring his coffee. "I'm sorry, Nia, I should have been out there when you arrived." "You couldn't have known," she said. "But tell me, have you noticed anything off with the ground crew lately?" Elias hesitated. Then he sighed. "Honestly? Yeah, there's been tension. They never say anything to my face, but I've overheard comments. Little things. Like when I mentioned you were flying in from Lagos, one of them said, 'She's really running things from Africa?'" Like it was a joke, Nia nodded. She wasn't surprised, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a different way. "Did they ever question your authority?" she asked. "Not directly," he said, "but they'd double-check my flight plans with Skyward instead of just following protocol. Like they didn't trust my judgment unless it came from someone higher up." They both knew what higher up meant. Back at her office, Nia called her legal advisor, a sharp woman named Priya, who'd helped her navigate everything from patent disputes to international partnerships. She laid out what she'd found. "This isn't illegal," Priya said after reviewing the documents, "but it's definitely unprofessional, and if you want to terminate the contract with Skyward, you have full grounds. The service agreement includes a clause about respectful and professional conduct. What happened at the tarmac? That violates it. But I don't just want to fire them," Nia said. "I want to understand how this happened. And make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." Priya was silent for a moment. "Then you'll need to go beyond legal action. You'll need to change the culture, not just on your jet, but in the industry." That idea stuck with her. Over the next few days, Nia dug deeper. She reached out to other private jet owners, women, people of color, younger entrepreneurs, and asked if they'd ever felt out of place in aviation spaces. The stories poured in. A Latina founder told her she was asked to show ID 5 times during one trip, even though she'd flown the same route for years. An Indian tech executive said his crew once assumed his wife was the owner because she looked more like a CEO. A black investor in his 60s admitted he started wearing a suit every time he boarded. Just to avoid questions, it wasn't just her. It was a pattern. Meanwhile, the video from Scottsdale kept spreading, not in a sensational way. No clickbait headlines or dramatic music, but steadily through shares and comments. People weren't just reacting to the injustice. They were relating to it. "This happened to my aunt at a country club," one comment read. "They thought she was the caterer." Another, "My mom owns her own dental practice and got asked if she was the receptionist by a patient." Nia read every comment. She didn't respond, but she saved them in a folder labeled "Why This Matters." Then came the backlash. A few online commentators pushed back. She should have just shown ID and moved on, one wrote. Making a scene over nothing. Another said, private aviation is exclusive by design. Don't act surprised when people assume you don't belong. A podcast host even called her entitled for expecting special treatment. Nia didn't engage. But the words stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed how deeply people misunderstood the issue. This wasn't about special treatment, it was about basic respect, about being seen for who you are, not who someone assumes you should be. One evening, as she sat on her balcony watching the city lights flicker on, her phone buzzed. It was a message from a young woman named Tasha, a student at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. I saw the video, she wrote. I'm training to be a pilot. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be taken seriously. Your story gave me hope. Nia typed back right away. You belong in the sky. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. That exchange stayed with her longer than any online argument. By the end of the week, Nia had made up her mind. She wasn't just going to replace the crew. She was going to rebuild the entire system around her aircraft, from hiring to training to daily operations. And she wanted people who understood what it meant to be overlooked, underestimated, or told you don't fit. She reached out to a nonprofit that supported women and minorities in aviation. She contacted flight schools with diverse student bodies. She even called a retired Air Force pilot she'd met at a conference years ago, a woman named Miriam who now mentored young aviators. I need a new team, Nia told her. Not just skilled, but thoughtful. People who know what it's like to walk into a room and have to prove yourself twice. Miriam smiled through the phone. I know exactly who to recommend. As Nia began drafting the termination letters for Skyward Management, she didn't feel anger. She felt clarity. This wasn't just about one bad interaction. It was about creating a space where someone like Tasha wouldn't have to go through what she did, where ownership wasn't questioned based on appearance, where respect was automatic, not earned through performance. She signed the letters, sealed the envelopes, and handed them to Lynn. Send them today, she said. Then she opened a new document on her laptop. At the top, she typed 3 words, Clear Skies Initiative. She didn't know yet what it would become, a training program, a scholarship fund, a new standard for private aviation, but she knew it had to start somewhere. And sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a single moment of being told you don't belong, and choosing to stay anyway. The letters went out on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, Skyward Management had called 3 times. Their tone shifted with each call, from confusion to defensiveness to something that sounded like panic. Nia didn't take the calls. She let Lynn handle it with clear instructions. No negotiations. No explanations beyond what's in the contract. The relationship is terminated, effective immediately. But while the business side was clean and final, the human side was messier. That afternoon, Carter showed up at her office. Not in uniform, just in a plain button-down and jeans, looking like any other person trying to fix a mistake. Security stopped him in the lobby. He says he needs to speak with you, the guard told Nia over the intercom. Says it's urgent, she almost said no. But something made her pause. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the memory of his face on the tarmac, how quickly confidence had turned to shock. Or maybe it was because she knew that real change didn't just happen through firing people, it happened when people changed. Send him up, she said. Carter looked smaller in person without the uniform. He fidgeted with the strap of his bag, eyes darting around the minimalist office like he expected to be scolded in front of an audience. When Nia offered him a seat, he hesitated before sitting on the very edge of the chair. I didn't know, he started, voice low. I swear if I'd known it was you. It shouldn't have mattered, Nia said gently, not unkindly. Even if I wasn't the owner, I was a guest at a private terminal. I deserved basic courtesy. He nodded quickly. You're right. I was wrong. I made an assumption, and it was a bad one. She studied him. He wasn't lying. He seemed genuinely shaken, not just by losing the job, but by realizing what his assumptions said about him. That was rare. Most people doubled down. But Carter was trying to face it. Do you know why you assumed I wasn't the owner? She asked. He swallowed. I guess. I've never seen someone who looks like you with a jet like that. Not in person. And I just filled in the blanks. That's the problem, Nia said. The world is full of people who don't fit the old pictures. And if we keep acting like they're exceptions, We'll keep making the same mistakes. They talked for nearly an hour, not about blame, but about blind spots. Carter admitted he'd grown up in a small town where success looked one way: white, male, polished. He'd never questioned it until now. He even shared that his younger sister, who was mixed race, had been passed over for a promotion last year despite better qualifications. I defended the company at the time, he said, shame creeping into his voice. Now I wonder if I was part of the problem. Before he left, Nia handed him a brochure, still in draft form, for the Clear Skies Initiative. If you're serious about learning, she said, this program will launch next month. It includes bias awareness training, leadership workshops, and mentorship. It's not a guarantee of rehiring, but it's a start. He took it like it was something precious. Thank you, he said, and for the first time he looked her in the eye. After he left, Nia sat quietly for a long time. She wasn't softening her stance, her jet, her rules, but she realized punishment alone wouldn't fix the system. Awareness had to be part of the solution. Over the next week, she met with Miriam, the retired pilot she'd contacted. Miriam brought 2 candidates with her, both women, both under 35, both from backgrounds rarely seen in private aviation. One was a former Air National Guard navigator named Jessa, sharp-eyed and calm under pressure. The other was Amara, a flight engineer who'd grown up in Compton and put herself through flight school by working nights at an auto shop. Nia interviewed them not just on technical skill, which was impressive, but on how they handled being the only one in a room. Amara laughed softly when asked. I stopped counting how many times I've been mistaken for catering staff, she said. But I learned to walk in like I own the place because one day I will. Jessa was more reserved but equally clear. Respect isn't given based on your title, she said. It's given based on how you treat people. I never forget that. Nia hired them on the spot. With Captain Elias still at the helm, she now had a core team that reflected the world she believed in, not the one stuck in the past. They spent days together going over protocols, not just for safety and service, but for inclusion. What if a passenger looked out of place? What if someone questioned their authority? They role-played scenarios, developed a code of conduct, and agreed on one rule above all: assume competence. Assume belonging. Meanwhile, the Clear Skies Initiative began taking shape. Nia partnered with 2 historically black colleges with aviation programs, funded scholarships for 10 students, and worked with a diversity consultant to design a certification course in unconscious bias for aviation professionals. It wasn't just about her jet. It was about changing the pipeline. She also made a quiet decision. She wouldn't sue Skyward. Legal action might feel satisfying, but it would drag the story into courtrooms and headlines, turning it into a spectacle. She wanted it to be a lesson, not a battle. Instead, she wrote a letter, not to the media, but to the aviation industry. She sent it to trade publications, flight schools, management companies, even the FAA. In it, she didn't name names or rehash the incident. She simply shared what she'd learned, that assumptions about who belongs in private aviation were limiting talent, hurting service, and reinforcing outdated norms. And she invited others to join the Clear Skies Initiative, not as a charity but as a standard. Some ignored it. A few wrote back with skepticism. But others, small operators, young entrepreneurs, even a few legacy firms, responded with interest. One CEO of a regional charter company wrote, "We've had similar issues. We'd like to pilot your training with our team." That gave her hope. Then came the unexpected call from a documentary filmmaker, not a sensationalist, but a respected journalist who'd covered social innovation for years. "I'd like to tell this story," she said. Not as a viral moment, but as a case study in quiet leadership. Nia hesitated. She didn't want to be a symbol. But she also knew visibility could help others feel less alone. Only if we focus on the solution, not the scandal, she said. The filmmaker agreed. As summer turned to fall, Nia returned to the Scottsdale airfield, not for a flight, but for a small gathering. She stood near the same spot where she'd been turned away, now surrounded by 20 young people, mostly women, many of color, who'd been awarded Clear Skies scholarships. They wore flight suits, nervous and excited, taking photos with Captain Elias and Amara. A reporter from a local news station asked her, "Do you feel vindicated?" Nia shook her head. "This isn't about being right. It's about making room. For them." She nodded toward the group. "They're the future. I just helped clear the runway." Later that evening, back in her hotel room, she scrolled through messages from people who'd seen the coverage. One stood out. A note from a flight attendant at a major airline who'd been denied promotion after reporting bias. "Your story gave me the courage to file a formal complaint," she wrote. "Thank you for showing us that dignity is non-negotiable." Naya saved it next to Tasha's message. She thought about Carter, about Jessa, about the quiet ripple this one moment had created. It wasn't perfect. The industry wouldn't change overnight. But change had begun, not with a shout but with a choice. The choice to see people clearly, to question assumptions, to build something better, one hire, one policy, one conversation at a time. And as she looked out the window at the desert sky, stars beginning to appear, she felt something she hadn't in weeks. Peace. Not because the problem was solved, but because she was no longer alone in facing it. The sky was big enough for everyone. All they had to do was look up and make space. The morning of the press briefing was cool for Scottsdale. Just a hint of autumn in the air, though the sun still rose with its usual desert boldness. Nia arrived early, not in a rental car this time, but in a quiet electric sedan with tinted windows. She wore the same kind of simple linen dress as before, but today it felt different. Not like armor, but like intention. She wasn't here to shame anyone. She was here to reset the tone. The airfield had been arranged with care. A small stage stood near the hangar. Not grand or flashy, just a wooden platform with a single mic and the Solarigrid logo projected softly on a screen behind it. Chairs were set out in a semicircle, not rows. More like a conversation than a performance. A few reporters milled about, along with representatives from aviation school's nonprofit partners and a handful of scholarship recipients from the Clear Skies Initiative, all dressed in crisp flight trainee uniforms. Nia walked among them, shaking hands, asking names, listening more than speaking. She wanted this to feel human, not staged, not polished for optics, but real. When it was time, she stepped up to the mic. No teleprompter, no script, just her voice calm and clear. 2 months ago, she began, I stood right here and was told I didn't belong on my own plane. A ripple went through the small crowd. Some had seen the video, others had only heard rumors. But hearing her say it plainly, without anger or drama, made it land differently. I could have walked away, she continued. I could have fired the crew and never looked back. And for a while, that's what I thought I'd do. But then I realized this wasn't just about me. It was about who gets to be seen as capable, as worthy, as belonging in spaces of power and privilege. She paused, letting the words settle. So instead of just ending a contract, I started something new. She introduced the Clear Skies Initiative, not as a charity, but as a commitment. A partnership with 3 aviation training programs to fund full scholarships for underrepresented students, a certification course in inclusive service for private aviation crews, developed with psychologists and industry veterans, and a mentorship network connecting new pilots and engineers with seasoned professionals who looked like them, talked like them, and understood their journey. Then she did something unexpected. She invited Carter onto the stage. He walked up slowly, visibly nervous, dressed in a plain navy blazer, the same color as his old uniform, but without the insignia. The crowd murmured. Cameras clicked. Naya turned to him. Carter completed the first round of our bias awareness training last week, she said. He's not back on my crew, but he's committed to doing better. And that matters. Carter stepped to the mic. His voice shook at first, but he steadied it. I made a mistake based on how someone looked, he said. I assumed I knew who belonged and who didn't. I was wrong. And I'm grateful for the chance to learn, not just apologize. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make excuses. He just stood there, accountable. And in that moment, something shifted, not just for him, but for everyone watching. Change wasn't about perfection. It was about willingness. After the briefing, the media swarmed, but not with gotcha questions or dramatic angles. The tone had been set. This wasn't a scandal. It was a story about responsibility. One reporter asked, Do you think other companies will follow your lead? I hope so, Nia said. But even if they don't, we'll keep building. Because this isn't about convincing the industry to see us. It's about creating our own runway. Back in California, the response poured in, not just from the public, but from unexpected corners. A major aircraft manufacturer reached out to sponsor 10 more scholarships. A private equity firm that managed luxury assets asked to pilot the Clear Skies training with their entire fleet. Even Skyward Management sent a formal letter, not defending themselves, but offering to enroll their staff in the program. Nia accepted. She knew optics could be faked, but action couldn't. And if they were willing to do the work, she wouldn't shut the door. At Solara Grid, morale soared. Employees shared the press clips in group chats. One engineer posted on the company intranet, "Today I walked into a client meeting and didn't shrink myself. Because I saw Nia stand tall and remembered I belonged too." Investors noticed. Not because they cared about the story's emotional weight, but because they saw leadership. In a world where brands were increasingly judged by their values, Nia hadn't just protected her reputation, she'd strengthened it. Solara's stock rose 7% that week, not from hype but from confidence. People trusted leaders who acted with integrity, especially when no one was watching. But not everyone was on board. A few conservative commentators called the initiative woke overreach. One aviation blog ran a piece titled, "When Private Jets Become Political." A former pilot wrote a letter to an industry magazine, claiming that merit should be the only standard, as if inclusion somehow lowered the bar. Nia read the critiques. She didn't respond publicly, but she saved them, not out of bitterness, but as reminders. Reminders that progress always meets resistance, that comfort zones don't give up easily, and that the people who say this isn't about race are often the ones who've never had to think about it. What mattered more were the quiet messages that kept coming in. A single mom in Atlanta wrote that her daughter, who'd wanted to be a pilot since age 9, now had a name to look up to. A flight school in Oklahoma said enrollment from Black and Latina students had doubled since the story broke. A retired airline captain sent Nia a handwritten note. "I flew for 35 years and never saw a crew like yours. Thank you for making the sky look like the world." Then came the invitation from Nairobi. The Kenyan Ministry of Energy asked Nia to speak at the launch of a new solar microgrid project, one powered by Solara technology. It was a full-circle moment. She'd started her company to bring clean, reliable energy to communities ignored by big utilities. Now she was being welcomed, not just as a vendor but as a partner in nation-building. Before she left, she met with her new flight team. Captain Elias, Jessa, and Amara stood in the hangar, going over final checks. The jet gleamed under the morning light, but it felt different now. Not just a machine, but a symbol of what was possible when you refused to accept the status quo. "You ready?" Elias asked as she boarded. She smiled. More than ever. The flight to Nairobi was smooth. As they crossed the Atlantic, Nia looked out at the endless blue and thought about how far she'd come. Not just in miles, but in clarity. She hadn't set out to start a movement. She'd just wanted to go home after a long trip. But sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with a single no. No, I won't be erased. No, I won't accept less. No, I won't let this happen to someone else. And sometimes that no becomes a yes. Yes to new voices, yes to second chances, yes to building something that lasts. In Nairobi, she was greeted by government officials, community leaders, and a group of young engineers, many of them women, who'd been trained on Solara systems. At the launch ceremony, a village elder placed a beaded bracelet on her wrist. "You didn't just bring power," he said through a translator. "You brought dignity." That night, back at her hotel, she called Lynn. "How's the Clear Skies waitlist looking?" she asked. "Over 200 applicants," Lynn said. "And we've only opened it for 3 weeks." Nia smiled. "Good. Let's double the scholarships next year." She hung up and opened her laptop. On the screen was a draft of a children's book she'd been quietly working on. A story about a girl who dreams of flying, told through the eyes of her grandmother, who once walked 10 miles to school because no one believed she deserved an education. The title? Sky is No Limit. She didn't know if it would ever be published. But writing it felt like another kind of runway, paved not with asphalt, but with hope. And as she typed, the city lights of Nairobi shimmered outside her window, steady and bright, powered by the very technology she'd fought to build. Not for fame, not for praise, but because everyone deserves light, and everyone deserves to belong. On the ground, in the boardroom, and high above the clouds. The Nairobi sun rose slowly over the Ngong Hills, painting the sky in soft golds and pinks. Inside the private terminal, Nia stood near the jet's open door, sipping tea from a thermos she'd brought from home. She wasn't in a rush. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. Captain Miriam Adebawale descended the stairs with a clipboard in hand, her flight suit crisp, her steps confident. She'd joined the team just 6 weeks ago, handpicked not just for her flawless record as a pilot, but for the way she carried herself. Calm, capable, and utterly unshaken by doubt. She was Nigerian-American, raised in Houston, and had once told Naya over coffee, "I didn't just want to fly. I wanted to make sure the next girl who looks like me doesn't have to prove she belongs twice." Now, as Miriam greeted her with a warm smile and a firm handshake, Nia felt a quiet swell of pride. This was what it looked like when intention became reality. "All set for Nairobi?" Miriam asked, though she already knew the answer. "Ready," Nia said, stepping aboard. The cabin was familiar but refreshed, new seat covers in earthy tones, a small bookshelf stocked with titles by African authors, and a framed photo on the console, the group of Clear Skies Scholarship recipients from Scottsdale, grinning in their flight trainee uniforms. It wasn't decoration. It was a reminder. As the engines hummed to life, Nia settled into her seat by the window. Below, ground crew waved. Among them was a young woman in a bright yellow vest, part of a new local aviation partnership Solara had helped fund. She caught Nia's eye and gave a small, proud nod. Nia returned it. The jet lifted off smoothly, climbing above the city until Nairobi became a patchwork of green and red rooftops, then faded into the distance. Up here there was no noise, no judgment, no assumptions. Just Sky. Nia opened her tote and pulled out a folded piece of notebook paper. It was the letter from the girl in Detroit, the one who'd seen the video months ago and now wanted to be a pilot. She'd written it in careful cursive, with a drawing of a plane in the corner and a rainbow trailing behind it. "You showed me that dreams don't have a color," it read. "I'm saving up for flight camp. Thank you for seeing me before I even got there." Nia kept it close, not as a trophy but as a compass. Back home, the Clear Skies initiative had grown faster than anyone expected. What started as a response to one moment of exclusion had become a movement. 28 students were now in training across 3 countries. The bias certification course had been adopted by 2 major private aviation firms. And just last week, the FAA had invited Nia to join an advisory panel on diversity in aerospace leadership. She hadn't said yes yet, not because she didn't want to help, but because she was learning the difference between presence and impact. Being in the room mattered, but only if you used your voice to open the door wider for others. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lynn. Tasha passed her first solo flight exam. She sent a video. Nia tapped play. There, on a small airstrip in Florida, stood Tasha, same bright eyes, same determined smile, standing beside a Cessna, helmet in hand, wind in her braids. "This is for you, Ms. Okoro," she said to the camera. Clear skies ahead. Nia watched it twice. Then she saved it to a folder labeled "Why We Keep Going." The flight to Nairobi was short but long enough for reflection. She thought about Carter, who'd recently completed the full training program and was now mentoring new hires at a regional charter company. She thought about Amara, who'd started a podcast for women in aviation maintenance. She thought about Jessa, who'd just been promoted to first officer on international routes. None of this had been part of the plan. But sometimes the best plans are the ones you make while cleaning up someone else's mess. When the jet touched down in Nairobi, a small crowd waited, not officials this time, but community members from the village where Solara's newest microgrid was powering a school, a clinic, and a water pump for the first time. Children ran alongside the taxiing plane, waving and laughing. One held a handmade sign that read, "Thank you for our light." Nia stepped out and was immediately surrounded, not by security but by gratitude. A teacher pressed a woven basket into her hands. A boy shyly handed her a drawing of the solar panels with the sun smiling above them. An elder placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Simply, you kept your word," that evening. After a modest dinner under string lights in the village square, Nia sat with Miriam on a low stone wall, watching fireflies drift through the warm air. "You ever think about how different this all could have been?" Miriam asked, sipping from a bottle of water. "Every day," Nia said. "If I'd just walked away that day in Scottsdale, none of this happens." "But you didn't walk away," Miriam said. "You stayed, and you built something that outlasts the moment." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the hum of the new solar inverters in the distance, a steady, quiet pulse of energy where there used to be darkness. Back in California a week later, Nia received a package with no return address. Inside was a model of a Gulfstream G650, hand-painted in soft blues and golds, with a tiny figure in the cockpit wearing a flight suit and braids. Taped to the bottom was a note. "One day this will be mine, too. Until then, I fly in your sky." She placed it on her desk right next to the Detroit girl's letter. The media had mostly moved on. The viral moment had faded, as all moments do. But the work hadn't. The Clear Skies waitlist now had over 500 names. Solara had just signed a deal to bring solar power to 12 more villages across East Africa, and Nia had quietly begun funding a scholarship for girls in rural Nigeria to study engineering, named after her grandmother, the woman who'd given her the gold chain she still wore. She wasn't doing it for headlines. She was doing it because someone once told her she didn't belong, and she refused to let that lie become someone else's truth. One rainy afternoon, she visited a high school in Compton. She didn't come as a CEO or a philanthropist, but as a guest speaker for a career day. The students were skeptical at first, another successful person telling them to dream big. But when she talked about being turned away from her own jet, about working nights to afford her first laptop, about crying in an airport bathroom after being told her idea was too ambitious, they leaned in. Afterward, a girl with locks and a NASA t-shirt stayed behind. "Did you ever feel like you were faking it?" she asked. "All the time," Nia admitted. "But faking it until you make it only works if you're also building something real underneath." The girl nodded, then handed her a folded piece of paper. "I'm designing a drone that can deliver medicine to remote areas," she said. "Will you look at my plan?" Nia took it. "I'd be honored." That night she added the girl's name to the Clear Skies mentorship list. The story didn't end with a grand finale or a dramatic showdown. It ended as most real stories do, with small acts of courage, quiet persistence, and the kind of legacy that grows in the spaces between headlines. Nia never sought to be a symbol. She just wanted to be seen. And in choosing to stand her ground, she made space for hundreds of others to stand tall too. Now, when she boards her jet, no one questions her. Not because she demands it, but because the culture has shifted. Respect is no longer earned through performance, it's given as a starting point. And in that simple change, everything transforms. As the plane climbs once more, this time heading home after a long journey, Nia looks out at the clouds, endless and open. There's no clearance section up here, no gatekeepers, just sky, and the quiet certainty that belonging isn't something you prove. It's something you claim, gently but firmly, every time you show up as yourself. And high above the world, in a cabin filled with light and purpose, she finally feels at peace, not because she won, but because she built something worth flying for.